Excuse me for my French accent. I hope that you will be able to understand what I say. It's not always very easy. First of all, I have to speak about French poetry. And then I shall read some poems. And after, if you want, you can ask some questions and I shall try to answer. Okay? We do like that? Just a question first. How many people understand French here? One? I know there is another one that is shy. Okay. French poetry, first of all. I could say that 20th century was something like a golden age for French poetry. After the great catastrophe, the great disaster of the First World War, you know, there were 9 million dead soldiers during the First World War, more than 1.5 million in France itself. Young poets wanted to revolt against the society which produced such a disaster. And this poetic, artistic revolt at the beginning was something like a nihilist revolt, anarchist revolt, called Dada. They wanted to destroy the culture of the past. Welcome. Sit down and we are going on, no problem. I was just beginning to speak about the French poetry in the 20th century. And I said that after the First World War, the young poets wanted to revolt. There is a great French poet who took part in the war, Guillaume Apollinaire. But his poems, which are wonderful, have some complex position in front of the war. On one hand, he was fascinated by the war, and on the other hand, he was against it, but he took part. But the younger poets, I mean poets like André Breton, Louis Aragon, Paul Éluard, took part as young soldiers. And when they saw all the horrors of the war, they came back. They wanted another world. It was the beginning of the very well-known artistic movement, surrealism. Surrealism is not only a nihilist revolt, it's the discovery of a new territory for poetry and imagination. At the same time, when the discoveries of Freud were spreading in Europe and in France, they discovered that the subconscious of the spirit, of the mind of everybody, is a new territory for imagination. And they created new way of making poetry. For instance, they invented what they called écriture automatique, automatic writing. It was like a play, to write all that go through your head without thinking, without the control of the reason. And at the end, you can notice that it's not anything, it's something sometimes very, very beautiful and surprising. Of course, because they were very well educated, they had a personal great poetic culture. So when they said n'importe quoi, anything, it was not n'importe quoi, it was something. And at the same time, they invented new images. For instance, I give you just one example. Paul Éluard wrote a poem in which he says, La terre est bleue comme une orange. The earth is blue like an orange. The first impression, it seems to be strange, blue like an orange. But if you think a little, if you feel a little after, you can find that it's a true image, exact image. So it was a great revolution, which had big consequences in all the culture and the arts. But in the 30s, when the fascism was growing up in Italy, in Germany, the time was not to laboratory experiments. And so many of them gave up experimental poetry and surrealism to join the people. It was the history of what we call la poésie de la résistance, resistance poetry, with poets like Aragon, Éluard, René Char, Pierre Emmanuel, a lot of them. I have to say that among these resistant poets against fascism, there were mainly Catholic and communist poets in a kind of alliance. Some of them took part in the resistance with the weapons in the mountains, over only by the pen. But it was very courageous at the same time, because they could be put in jail and even killed. It was a very important and not so well-known moment for French poetry. Louis Aragon, especially and Paul Éluard, were the two main poets of this resistance, but they were not alone. After the war, some of other poets who were very near of them had a great influence on people. I'm thinking, for instance, of Jacques Prévert, who was one of the most popular poets in France. He was able to make poetry with the everyday language, with the people's sentences, and with a great sense of humor and a great satirical sense. After that period, of course, after the fight, a lot of poets withdrew from the battlefield, if I can say it. And once again, the time seemed to be to more linguistic experiments. For instance, there was a little movement called Oulipo. For them, poetry was a way to play with words, like a combinatory of words. And it was interesting. But of course, it touched few people. The poets of the resistance wrote poems that sometimes were put in music and sung by Jean Ferrat, by a lot of singers. And so, when poetry is sung, it can touch a wider audience and touch people in the street, common people, if I can say. In the 50s, it was different. It was more a time of inner by some critics. Eugène Guilvic was a very close friend. He was a great French poet of his time. These poets despite the fact that some of them took part in the resistance and were close friends with the Surrealists, reacted against Surrealism. And they wanted to leave the territory of dreams, the territory of imagination, which was the main territory for Surrealist poets, and to go down to the earth, to grasp reality, to speak about everyday objects, to things. A little bit like in American poetry, you know, what they call objectivism. It's another way to do that. But it was the same seek for grasping the real world, if I can say that. At the same time, these poets say something about future, hope. For instance, there is a little line of my friend Eugène I want to tell you. He wrote, "In a single blade of grass, there is utopia." I think it's true because grass always stand up and tries to go to the light, like human beings do, if I could say that. So there's also a kind of moral lesson of this materialist poetry. After that, I can see two big tendencies in French poetry. One would be called experimental poetry, language poetry, and the other one, a more humanistic poetry. The first tendency, I can give the name of Jacques Roux. He was at the same time, he's still alive, but he's very old now, a mathematician and a poet. And in his poetry, he rejects ideas, he rejects feelings, and it's a play with words. Sometimes very good play, sometimes something else. On the other hand, there is another great poet whose name is Yves Bonnefoy. And for me, I know him very well, of course. He is a kind of representative of the classic humanism, idealistic humanism. He wants to speak of the presence. Which presence, I don't know exactly, but the presence. His poetry is a reaction against the consent, the logic, thinking, and he thinks that poetry is able to touch the truth, the very reality, specific reality, beyond the screen of the consent. So, as he says, anti-Platonic poetry. But for me, it's still very idealistic. He speaks of the human essence, but very few of concrete human beings. We had speeches on this subject together. And I cannot make a complete landscape of French poetry. I would like to say something about young poetry now. I published 2 years ago a big anthology of young poets, because I was wondering whether there is something new in French poetry or not. Is it only the following of the 20th century or not? And I can say that there is something new. Young poets are more committed with the social reality. Maybe because they have a lot of social and economical problems, so they express it in their poems. Before, most of the poets were scholars, teachers, and now it's different. So it's a first fact, more committed with social reality. Secondly, it's a poetry which gives a bigger place to orality. Now poets are used to tell their poems in front of an audience. And a lot of them perform. When I began as a poet in the 80s, people thought that poetry was a work on writing. And now, for a lot of poets, maybe a majority of poets, it's a work on speaking, word, on oral. But of course, you need to write. The third fact, new fact for me, is the coming of women poets. Of course, in the history of French poetry, there are great women poets, as Gisela in the time of the Renaissance of the 16th century. But there are a minority, a little minority. And now it's changing. There are a lot of women who write and publish poems. And of course, they introduce something new in poetry. Maybe it is too early to make a complete analysis, an objective analysis of French poetry. I don't know what is going to happen now. Generally speaking, I could say that if you compare French poetry to US poetry, to Russian poetry, I don't know enough Indian poetry to say it, but somebody can think that French poets are obsessed with language. For most of them, poetry is a matter of words, a matter of language. Personally, I do think, of course, you need to work with words. It's an art of words. You have to become an artist of words. But poetry is not made only of words. It's also made of feelings, and I could say also of thinking. Poets are not philosophers, but they have the right to think also. And I think that the poem can be a place where you reunify emotion and reason, thinking and feeling. You reunify human being. We live in a society where human beings are divided. They are compelled by the economy to be very efficient, to deal with numbers, very few with images, very few with imagination, very few with dreams. The right of dreaming is generally forbidden. We have to work, produce, get money, and of course it's very bad for poetry. But it shows the absolute necessity of poetry. In such a world, we need poetry to win the right to dream again, to imagine our future. Now, sometimes it's like if the future was cut, like a leg, you know? We miss one of our leg or arm, and we need it. We have to recreate the imagination of future. And for that, we need a poetry, an active poetry of hope. For me, it's my personal opinion about poetry. Poetry can be something like a sensitive consciousness, which deals with truth. But the truth, not a general truth, but the truth of the human soul, the human being, the human individual himself or herself. And myself, ourself, we are like strangers for ourselves. We have to discover our very mind, our very soul, to dive into ourselves. And it was the, the work of French poetry for 1 century to explore the cave of the subjectivity of the individual imagination. But of course, when you go very deep in this direction, you can lose communication, you can lose contact with the others, and produce a very obscure poetry. So I think that modern poetry, a new modern poetry, must return Rimbaud's phrase, sentence, to say, the other is also I, is also me. Because we are not so different from each other. We have about all of us the same problems, the same phantasm, the same imagination, the same fears, the same hopes. And that's why poetry is possible. That's why poetry can be shared with other people. So for me, there is a big issue in modern poetry in France, and not only in France, is maybe we can overthrow the limit of some individualism, which is dominant in Western countries, of course. I don't speak about Asia and India, I don't know. But in France, for instance, the selfishness, the cult of the myself is very important for a lot of people. And poetry helps to go beyond that, to rediscover that we are human beings and to share this humanity. So maybe I made a too long speech. I ask you to forgive me for this speech. Do you want to ask some questions now, or do I read some poems now? As you like it. I read? Okay. Yesterday, during the launching of the festival, I had a good surprise because the great Tamil actor Prakash Raj read one of my poems. Of course, he read it in English, so I propose to read it now in French. For reading, I have to leave my glasses because I am a very young man. Facile. So you can hear something of the music of French language, which is of course quite different than English. Facile. C'est assez facile, changer la nuit en jour. Le soleil fait ça tous les matins. C'est assez facile, changer la glace en eau. Quelques rayons suffisent. C'est assez facile, faire naître des fleurs au bout de nos vieilles branches. Un peu de printemps suffit. C'est assez facile, changer ce monde inégal et injuste. Il suffit pour cela d'assez peu s'unir. And in English now, for me to read my poems, my own poems in English, it's rather difficult, but I shall try for you. Simple. It's quite easy to change day to night. The sun does it every morning. It's quite simple to change ice to water. A few rays will do. It's quite simple to produce flowers at the end of our old branches. A bit of spring time is enough. It's quite simple to change this unequal and unjust world. Not much is needed to come together. The second one, very short. I can read also in French and English if you want. First in English. A poppy. In the commercial area, among the cars and the advertising hoardings, in this place where no one pays it any attention, near the pavement, springing from a crack in the tarmac, a poppy, fragile and solitary, holds itself straight, brave, scarlet. How can we not be optimistic? And in French, un coquelicot. Dans la zone commerciale, parmi les voitures et les panneaux publicitaires, à cet endroit où personne ne fait attention à lui, près du trottoir, jaillissant d'une fissure dans le goudron, un coquelicot, fragile et solitaire, se tient droit, courageux, écarlate. Comment ne pas être optimiste? On liberty. My friend, don't be like the leaf which dances in the wind. Don't be like the plastic bag carried away by the gust, which flies and heads off hesitantly above us in the street, hither and thither, the transparent bag which rises and falls without knowing why, the free and powerless bag which goes where the wind goes, which escapes and can do nothing, finishing in the cold, naked arms of a tree attached to a branch or in the frozen water of a gutter. My friend, don't be the leaf or the plastic bag, free and intoxicated. Oh, strange translation. Free and important. My friend, be the wind. Yes, for preference, be the wind. You want it in French too, also, or not? Yeah? Yeah? You know, for me it's quite disturbing because in France, when you do such a thing, it means no. To say yes, we do like that. And to say no, like that. So I have to be used to your way of telling so. Sur la liberté. Mon ami, ne sois pas comme la feuille qui danse dans le vent. Ne sois pas comme le sac plastique emporté par la bourrasque qui s'envole et s'en va en hésitant au-devant de nous, dans la rue, de ci, de là. Le sac transparent qui monte et qui descend sans savoir pourquoi. Le sac libre et impuissant qui va où va le vent, qui s'échappe et n'y peut rien et finit dans les bras nus et froids d'un arbre accroché à une branche ou dans l'eau glacée du caniveau. Mon ami, ne sois pas la feuille, ni le sac en plastique, libre et ivre et impuissant. Mon ami, sois le vent, oui, sois plutôt le vent. All these poems are included in a book, a bilingual book in French and English, which title is If the Symptom Persists. But the title of the French book is a little different. It's If the Symptom Persists, Consult a Poet. Now a poem which is a little bit more provocative. I have been invited, I was invited 2 years ago in the north of India to take part in a literary festival in Bhopal. It was very interesting and very successful. But at the same time, I must say that I was amazed by some very nationalistic speeches I heard there. And even racist speeches, I could say. So, my poem, the title is The Poet is a Communist. Every poet, even if he ignores it, and even if he denies it, every poet is a communist. Every poet, always and everywhere, says that the world, the earth, and the oceans, the trees, the birds, the cities, and all that they include, even the palaces, the Champs-Élysées, the bridges on the Seine, the smile of women, even those who are not yours, but in truth, no one is your property, and the smile of infants, and that of humans, and the look of the animals, everything, the entire earth, the world and its seasons, autumn and its richness, winter and its pleasures, spring, its promises, summer and its harvest. Everything is ours. Everything that we don't possess by the powers that give up, that gives up, by the powers that give us imagination, poetry, and the necessary dream of humanity, everything belongs to us, and we belong to everything. All life on earth is our business. Everything speaks to us, and we pray, and we reply to everything. Everything is ours, and always and everywhere, everything is for us to share. Humble request. Humble request. Yes, I confess. I have written enough, frequently, poems against war, racism, exploitation, injustice, the destruction of people and of nature. I would love to ever write about subjects that truly deserve it. Women, children, flowers, birds. So then, please, my friends, do me a little favor. Get us free from capitalism. Maybe also some love poems if you want. I wanted to come with my wife, but she's very sick, so she remained in Paris, and I shall go back with her early because I don't want to let her alone too long. So I shall leave the festival on Thursday. 3 poems about love. Love's voyage. At first, you take one another by the hand shyly. Then you become bolder. You're taken by eyes. You're taken by lips. You are taken by the waist, by the haunches, by all the hills. You climb all the peaks. You rush down all the slopes together. You explore all the crevices. You venture onto the heights and into the abysses. Then, after a great voyage, tired and happy, you come back to the earth you've never left. You walk with small steps on the plain, on the town's pavements, or by the sea, and, as at the start, you hold one another by the hand. French, maybe. Le voyage de l'amour. Au début, on se prend par la main, timidement, puis on s'enhardit, on se prend par les yeux, on se prend par les lèvres, on se prend par la taille, on se prend par les seins, on se prend par le sexe, on se prend par toutes les collines, on escalade tous les monts, on dévale à deux toutes les pentes, on explore toutes les crevasses, on s'aventure dans les hauteurs et dans les abysses, puis, après un grand voyage, fatigué et heureux, on revient sur la terre qu'on n'a jamais quittée, on marche à petits pas dans la plaine, sur le trottoir de la ville ou en bord de mer, et, comme au début, on se tient par la main. Another love poem? Yeah? You don't make some? Instruction for loving. No. Poets haven't said everything about love. Loving is not just being in love. Loving is not just desiring. Loving is not only wanting to embrace, to kiss. Loving is not just about making love. Loving is not only fearing no longer to be loved. Loving shouldn't be torturing oneself, being jealous, tearing apart each other. Loving, as most ordinary people know, is also cooking, shopping, cleaning, washing the dishes, making jams, or writing a poem. Loving is caring for those who are close to you, caring about them. Loving is listening, talking, living. Loving is helping them as much as possible, and even more than that. Loving is also caring for public affairs. Loving is being united. Loving is a widely shared faculty and a full-time job. Maybe a last love poem. And after two political poems to make a conclusion, maybe. Empty hands for Patricia. I have nothing to give you today except two empty hands. But there are empty hands which might contain the cup of kisses, a face to caress, earth to dig, fruits to gather, a poem to write. As I am poor, I can offer you only the whole world. A poem about the American poet Jack Hirschman. I don't know if some of you know this poem. He was living in San Francisco. He was a close friend of the poet of the Beat Generation, for instance, Lawrence Ferlinghetti. I met them in San Francisco in a very well-known cafe, which used to be their headquarters, Café Trieste, with Lawrence Ferlinghetti. He was already about 100 years old. And Jack passed away now. He was a very great friend of us, and he was a very generous poet of love, but also poet fighting with homeless people for shelters, with immigrants, against racism, against war. And he created a new word in English, planetariat. We all know the old word proletariat, but he invented the word planetariat. And I wrote a poem about the planetariat, dedicated to Jack Hirschman. I read it first in French. Le planétariat. Nous qui n'avons qu'une terre à tenir dans nos mains, une terre à bercer, une terre à soigner, une seule terre pour patrie, une terre pour habiter et se tenir debout, les uns avec les autres. Nous qui n'avons rien que nos mains pour vivre, que nos rêves d'amour et nos nuits étoilées. Nous dont les ondes électromagnétiques parcourent le monde à la vitesse de la lumière. Nous qui nous parlons de bouche à oreille par-dessus les frontières. Nous qui ne sommes rien, mais dont tout dépend, et même le destin de la planète Terre. Nous les nouveaux parias, nous les ombres claires, nous les en nombre, nous les plus nombreux, nous sommes le peuple monde, le peuple à venir. Nous voici, nous venons, hommes, femmes, enfants. Terriens, nous sommes le planétariat. And in English, the planetariat. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it in English. Planetariat? Something like that? For Jack Hirschman. We have only one Earth. to hold in our hands, one earth to nurse, one earth to care for, one single earth for our native land, one earth on which to live and stand together, one and whole. We who have nothing but our hands for living, but our dreams of love, but our starry nights, we from whom the electromagnetic waves traverse the world at the speed of light, we who speak to ourselves from mouth to ear across the borders, we who are nothing but on whom everything depends, even the destiny of the planet Earth, we, the new pariahs, we, the clear shadows, we, the unnumbered, we, the most numerous, we are the world people, the people to come, men, women, children, earthling, we are the planetariat. Thank you very much for your very silent and wise audience. If you have some questions, if you want to speak a little bit, of course, I am available. I am here for that.
You have been talking, focused heavily on inclusion and poetry as an outreach project to a wider society, unity, togetherness. Certainly in my country, the dominant poetic debate now is based around what is called identity politics, which, without saying that people who didn't have a voice before are getting a voice now, which is great. Minorities of sexual, gender, race, but at the same time, unity is being abandoned in favour of us being a selection of different tribes, not together. I'm wondering if that similar argument is happening in France.
Not exactly, but it begins, yes, because of course we have the influence of the wind coming from the United States. And there is something very important in what you say. Of course, I think there is something very positive, very useful in the new movements for the recognition of rights of every minority. Sexual minority, gender minority, national minority, and so on. But I am a little bit concerned because I think that often with these fights, we give up with the fight for rights and equality to only ask for recognition. But the master can recognize you as a slave. You have the right to say, I am a slave and I am proud to be a slave. So I think the fight for recognition is not enough. We have to fight for equality. Equality between men and women, and not women against men or men against women. We have to fight for unity in the same time, as you say. And that's a main issue for politics, but also for poetry. What means a poetry which would enclosed in a gender? Of course, when I write love poems, I don't deny that I am a male poet, and the importance of the male sexual desire is real in my poetry. But in the same time, in a poem, you are both a male and a female, because human being is plural, and a poet is himself and another, as said Rimbaud, and as I am trying to say now too. So I am against this idea of a closure, of enclosing poetry in a closed identity. I think that it can be a catastrophe for mankind, for humanity, if we accept to be enjailed in our own identities, national identities, linguistic identities, and so on. Of course, everybody needs to have roots. But there are two ways of behavior to behave with roots. You can behave like a radish and diving into the earth, into the soil, where it's black, dark, and wet and cold. Or you can use your roots to make like a tree, try to grow up, to go to the sky, to have branches, to welcome the birds who come and sit on your branches, to sing with the wind. Two different ways of behaving with his own roots. And this is a major, not only political, but poetical question, human question, I think, for everybody. And I don't make a complete division between politics and poetics. Of course, I know that politics is something, poetry is something else. I have a very good friend, a US poet, whose name is Elliot Katz in New York. He uses to say, poetry and politics is like right hand and left hand, thanks. Right hand and left. I forgot the word left, it's strange. It's not the same. You can confuse them, but it's useful when the right hand and the left hand are able to work together, to make music together, to play together, and so on. So it's the same for poetry and politics. We don't confuse them, but we don't ignore each other. A politics without poetry is a poor politics, which very often, and we have seen this story in the recent past, degenerates in a simple way of taking the power, ruling economics. But a poetry without a political consciousness may become something very weak, very graceful maybe, but not very powerful. Of course, poetry by itself is unable to change something. It cannot stop a war. A poem cannot stop a missile. But it can change a little bit the mind. It can create a culture in which human life matters. Human culture matters. Human exchanges between languages, human conversation between culture becomes more important. Instead of launching missiles, we should launch poems on each other. Another question?
Any more questions?
In French?
Shall I?
In French or Malayalam?
Shall I speak in French?
Say, as you want.
I'll speak in English so that others can understand.
Of course, of course.
So, you talked about the advent of the leftist thought process in France and in general in Europe after the Second World War. We talked about Jean Ferrat and poets like him, and who were openly leftist and communist in their outlook. But today in Europe, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, there has been decline in the leftist movement. How does it reflect in the poetry of today? I mean, you talked about the young poets who are coming up. How committed to the art do you have such committed leftist poets coming up in France?
Yeah. I would like to say first that during the 20th century, there were a lot of communist poets all over the world. Mayakovsky, Bertolt Brecht, Pablo Neruda, Nicolas Guillen, Yanis Ritsos, Mahmoud Darwish, a Palestinian poet, and a lot. Because there was a hope and a great movement. A lot of people, a lot of masses of thought that humanity were able to build a new future, a common future, and to share, not to divide the earth, but to share the earth. After the split of Soviet Union, which is both the result of very serious inner problems, defaults, and also the pressure of West camp, a lot of poets withdrew of such a hope, in France too, but not all of them, of course. Sometimes, when some people ask me why I am still a communist, I used to answer by a poem in which I say, okay, if capitalism give up exploiting people, exploiting nature, making wars, I can accept to change myself. But now I don't see that capitalism on his side changed his nature. So I will not change my own personal nature. If I am alone, it's not important. But I am not alone. I can notice that among young people, there are more revolutionary thinkings and feelings. Of course, it will not take the same form. The political form will change. It's compulsory, more openly, in a kind of united front of the left, for instance. But the class struggle is going on. The problems are going on. They are more and more acute because now it's not only the exploitation of workers which threaten their own lives and the life of their family, but the exploitation of the earth which threatens the whole life, not only human life, but human and animal life on earth, and even plants. So if we want to save the earth, we have to change the world. It seems to be very hard, very impossible, but I think it is not. It is not. I hope that we shall not wait for a big catastrophe to change. Unfortunately, in the history of humanity, very often the big changes happened after big catastrophes. But I think there is a growing world consciousness. And I have still some hope, a very deep hope. I don't know if I answered to your question, not completely, but we can speak longer. We could speak a long time about this subject.
I'm glad to be standing here to express my word of thanks. A special thank to our chief guest, Francis Kaum, for accepting our invitation and for being here with us today. Your thoughts have truly inspired us. Thank you so.
And Les, who is here from Australia, we created a new international network of poets, whose name is Poets of the Planet. Our it's a kind of international of poets, very open-minded. We reject all kind of sectarianism, aesthetic or politic sectarianism. Our purpose is to promote poetry, to stand for peace, and to support the freedom of writers and poets, especially those who are in jail. So it's the beginning of a new movement, but I wanted to inform you of that. And till the war in Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia, and now the war in Palestine, in Gaza, with the slaughter of these people, the genocide of people, we decided to launch a worldwide chain of poems for peace. So if you write poems, if you have written poems for peace, don't hesitate to publish them, to send them, and to make this chain of poems for peace. Thanks.